We are descending into the World War II Japanese shipwreck, the Akibasan Maru. U.S. Navy pilots sank it here at Kwajalein Atoll in the Pacific on January 30th, 1944. It lies with at least 20 other Japanese ships that were also victims of the Allied campaign to capture the Marshall Islands. Little is left of the Battle of Kwajalein except memories and these silent wrecks still lying in the harbor where they were defeated, out of sight and forgotten until now. Not far away, the wrecks of American planes, heroes of World War II, discarded in the lagoon at Kwajalein when they were no longer useful. It is one of the most complete collections of World War II-era American warplanes ever assembled in one place. Corsairs, B-25s, C-46s, the Dauntless. Few people have ever seen these wrecks. They have been locked away, part of a restricted U.S. military base, for nearly 60 years. Time has taken its toll. The wrecks are slowly deteriorating. Now, for the first time, the U.S. military has granted permission to an outside film crew to document these wrecks for posterity before they are lost to the dusts of time. Kwajalein Atoll lies in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from any major landmass. It's part of the Marshall Islands, an island nation consisting of 30 atolls and over 1,000 individual islands. Kwajalein is large as atolls go, more than 50 miles across. An atoll is a ring of islands formed by coral reefs along the rim of an ancient volcano that has since sunk beneath the waves. The largest island at Kwajalein Atoll is called Kwajalein Island, located in the southern end of the atoll. At the northern end of the atoll is the island of Roi-Namur. These two islands have been the core of a restricted U.S. military base ever since they were captured from the Japanese in February of 1944. Although a Continental Airlines flight makes regular stops on its way between Hawaii and Guam, only people who have passed strict military clearance and have the appropriate papers can actually deplane. Kwajalein's central location in the Pacific makes it ideal for tracking satellites as they make their way around the Earth and for detecting enemy missiles heading for the United States. Its isolation also makes it perfect as a missile testing area. In fact, Kwajalein plays a critical role in the development of a space-based missile defense system. The low-lying islands are little more than sand spits with palm trees. Under the sand is a base of corals. In fact, the islands were created by coral, a tiny animal that lives with thousands of other coral polyps to form a tightly integrated colony, and thousands of colonies form a living reef. The coral colonies grow on the surface of an existing structure, like the rim of a dead volcano. The polyps secrete calcium carbonate, essentially limestone, as a skeleton. The limestone builds up over many centuries to form a structure. This structure provides the foundation for accumulations of sand that form islands. The coral reef is like a huge underwater Las Vegas, with its own version of brightly colored neon signs and its 24-hour lifestyle. The coral reef is home to many varied and peculiar creatures, a teeming city that never sleeps. The ever-present rulers of this vast city are the sharks. gray reef sharks, white-tipped reef sharks, and black-tipped reef sharks. They patrol the atoll in gangs, sometimes terrorizing the other fish, and as we discovered during our filming, a constant danger for the divers exploring the old wrecks. This hidden coral city is mostly unaware that on the surface, humans have occupied, fought, and died over these sandy island outcroppings. The Marshall Islands were settled about 2,000 years ago by people originally from Southeast Asia. There was occasional contact with Europeans over the centuries, but it wasn't until 1788 that regular contact with Europe began, when several British ships visited the islands. Over time, the Germans dominated trade, and some even settled here and raised families. So in 1885, Germany declared the Marshall Islands its protectorate. But at the conclusion of World War I, Japan won control of Kwajalein Atoll and eventually made it a military base. It was the easternmost projection of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. Kwajalein was the rendezvous point for Japanese submarines when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, United States military planners knew they had to capture Kwajalein and the rest of the Marshall Islands.
We had to take out the Marshall Islands. We could go on across the Pacific because this was the easternmost projection of the Japanese Empire up there.
Richard Sorensen nearly died saving his fellow soldiers in a fierce battle to capture Roi-Namur in 1944. The first attack on Kwajalein actually came in early 1942. Pearl Harbor was still fresh in everyone's memories. The U.S. launched an air campaign from the aircraft carrier Enterprise. It began at dawn on February 1, 1942, and lasted for 5 hours. The Navy reported transports in the harbor, military installations on land.
The reports from the pilots and the Navy said that they'd sunk tons of ships and really raised heck and whatnot, but we really never found any ships that were sunk during that raid. Mark
Miller is an underwater archaeologist, photographer, and author who has extensively explored and written about the wrecks at Kwajalein.
In January 1944, the culmination of many months of aerial attacks and softening up the atoll commenced with the invasion of the atoll.
The final battle for Kwajalein was dubbed Operation Flintlock. U.S. warplanes bombed Kwajalein and nearby military installations for days to weaken the Japanese ability to fight back, a lesson learned from an earlier U.S. disaster at Tarawa. Aircraft attacked the Japanese supply ships in the harbor as they attempted to escape. It was imperative to prevent the ships from escaping with munitions and supplies that could be used to arm other Japanese bases. The entire operation proceeded precisely according to plan, right down to the minute when the Marines landed on January 30th, 1944. Richard Sorensen, one of the Marines who landed on Roi-Namur, is a genuine war hero. In one quick moment, he made a selfless decision that saved the life of his fellow soldiers on Roi-Namur and took an action that should have killed him. Somehow, though, he survived and was awarded the Medal of Honor.
Well, I covered a grenade, and of course, they took 11 pieces of shrapnel out of me. We were in the first wave, and of course, we were giving support to an infantry platoon, but we landed just left to the pier, and then our objective was to go through the island and move as fast as we possibly could, and eliminate everything that was in front of us. With any resistance. We were the first to touch the beast, and we ran into moderate fire to start with, but as we moved further inland, then the opposition increased.
Sorensen's platoon fought its way about halfway across the island. By dark, they had actually gone too far. They had moved ahead of other units because they never got the word to straighten up the line. That made them vulnerable to friendly fire from behind. The next morning, after the sun came up, Private Sorensen's ragtag platoon was hit by a full company of Japanese soldiers.
250 men hit us, and we were just 30 men. That's when the grenade was thrown in, and of course, somebody yelled grenade, and I looked around, and there it was. And I knew that we had to hold our position, that it went off, and it could have wounded 5, 6, 7 people. And if the Japanese had broken through, they weren't taking any prisoners. They just slit our throats or killed us. So I went down on the grenade to keep the gun going and save my comrades.
Of the 27 Marines that fell on grenades in World War II, only 3 survived.
Just luck, grace of God.
Gradually, U.S. forces broke through and relieved the platoon. By that time, 17 were wounded.
When they finally put me on the stretcher to take me out, I think I was there about an hour. But then a sniper got one of the litter carriers. He went down, and I rolled out, and they put me back in, and the other guy came up and took the litter, and 4 guys on the litter. They hauled me back to the beach.
U.S. troops secured the island just after noon. There were almost 9,000 casualties, most of them Japanese. Only a handful of Japanese prisoners were taken. For the Japanese, to die in battle was the only honorable end. Sorensen had 6 surgeries. On July 19, 1944, he received his Congressional Medal of Honor while at the U.S. Naval Hospital in Seattle, Washington. Certainly, few deserve this medal more than Richard Sorensen.
You have just a second to make up your mind what you're going to do. You haven't got time to sit down and think, well, now should I do this, and this is the consequences and so forth. No, I knew what grenades did, and I wasn't trying to commit suicide, but when I came home, I put my medal in the drawer and forgot about it. Millie didn't know about it for I don't know how many years. And none of my kids knew about it till I got in their late teens. You don't talk about it.
The atoll was secured by February 4th in only 5 days. Nearly all the Japanese were killed. The main island of Kwajalein was devastated.
And the photos taken after the invasion, it's a scene from hell. It's absolutely unbelievable, the devastation that was wrought.
Today, above water, only fragments of its World War II past remain, barely preserved. Guns, bunkers, ammunition storage, command posts, all deteriorating badly with time. But underwater, at the bottom of the lagoon, Japanese shipwrecks wait silently to be explored, practically unchanged since they sank 60 years ago. After 2 years of effort, the film crew finally has their permit from the military, and their equipment is ready. Now, for the first time, the hidden casualties of the battle for Kwajalein will be recorded and photographed for history. The crew is heading out this morning from Kwajalein Island to dive on the Akibasan Maru. This Japanese ship is not far from the harbor. Tom Krasuski, a diver and radar engineer who works at Kwajalein, will explore the ship with Mark Miller.
The Akibasan Maru was a standard freighter of her day. She was built in 1924 and was 389 feet long, a medium-sized ship. It was owned by Mitsui Busan Kaisa, and during the onset of World War II was conscripted into the Japanese Navy as a transport. She was sunk on January 30th, 1944 by aircraft from U.S. carriers that were softening up the atoll for landing operations by the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, the Army taking the southern part of the atoll and the Marines the northern.
Even 60 years after its sinking, the Akibasan Maru is still leaking fuel oil from its tanks, leaving a telltale oil slick at the surface. The divers will be breathing a special mix of gases using a device called a rebreather that recycles the divers' exhaled breaths. This technology allows them to remain submerged for longer than divers with conventional scuba gear. Even more importantly, the rebreather produces fewer exhaled bubbles, which can be dangerous in the confines of a sunken ship. The large volume of bubbles that are common with conventional scuba gear can actually dislodge large quantities of rust and particulates from the ship's ceiling. This can create what's called a silt-out, a dangerous situation that reduces visibility. A diver can become disoriented and drown. Because the rebreathers require advanced training, the team includes technical diving expert Cliff Simino to oversee the diving safety of the project.
Okay guys, our mix is set for 32. That gives us a maximum operating depth of 130 feet. So the plan is 130 feet for 25 minutes with our mix, and then what we're going to do is we're going to work our way back up out of the cargo holds up onto the superstructure. So we'll treat it like a multi-level dive.
Sounds good.
Yep. Great.
The ship has 5 cargo holds. It carried rations, airplane parts, munitions, and candles, among other things.
Head back. Divers clear.
Ready, Tom? Hey, let's go.
The divers descend the steering mast of the vessel and swim forward on the port side and up over the bridgeway, where there's very little left now but the deck. And then they drop straight down into the number 2 cargo hold and move forward on the mezzanine level in 130 feet of water. That's where the pontoons are.
In the number 2 cargo hold, there are several airplane pontoons from the small fighter seaplanes that they had. I believe they were the roof. The Allied designation of the seaplane was the roof. There's some kanji still visible, some writing visible on one that says Weapons Bay. These one-man seaplanes essentially were a Zero fighter with pontoons attached. There was a squadron of them stationed on nearby Ibai Island.
The crew squeezes through a crack that developed between the number 1 and number 2 cargo holds. It's a tight fit, but they make it. The number 1 cargo hold also has airplane parts.
The most prominent feature are the aircraft wings. These wings were also destined for the seaplane base at Ibai. They had both large and small seaplanes. I'm not certain what class of aircraft these came from. The original skin covering on the wings has long since decayed, so what we see is the framework, the skeleton of the seaplane wings.
Like most of the ships sunk at Kwajalein, the Akibasan Maru was originally a civilian transport ship, not a warship. Like most of the civilian ships seized for war duty, the Akibasan Maru was used in its original configuration, with the addition of just a few weapons.
The general appearance of the Akibasan Maru is the epitome of a perfect shipwreck. It's upright on the bottom. It's perfectly sitting there, just like it's ready to sail away. All the doors are open. It's a very, very minor damage per se. You know, other ships you see are blown in two or upside down or on their sides. It's the epitome of the perfect shipwreck.
Like most shipwrecks, the Akibasan Maru is covered with marine life. Various forms of anemones, coral, sponges, and other creatures cling to the metal structure. Fish live and swim through the wreck, and this green turtle makes the ship its home. We're not sure how old this one is, but green turtles can live to 100 years, surviving on sponges and jellyfish. Perhaps this turtle is old enough to have witnessed the sinking of the Akibasan Maru in 1944. At the rear of the ship, in the number 5 cargo hold, the divers discover a most unusual cargo.
We found that crates of candles had been stowed on the mezzanine level of the cargo hold. Those wooden crates had decayed away. Marine life is consumed with Doritos, shipworms, and so forth. And the candles being released floated. The wax floats in seawater. Well, there was nowhere for it to go, so they covered the ceiling. And you'll still see many places where the wax candles are floated up on the overhead. You may see nothing on the deck, but you turn around upside down and look up, and hey, look, there's something stuck.
When the divers reach their bottom time limit, they leave the Akibasan Maru, slowly ascending the line. They stop at 20 feet for decompression on 50% oxygen. Today, the crew is headed out from Roi-Namur in search of the airplane graveyard. This area of the lagoon is littered with hundreds of U.S. warplanes that were discarded at the end of the war because they were too damaged to be saved. The graveyard includes one of the most complete collections of World War II military aircraft anywhere in the world. Before every dive, the team members carefully double-check each other's gear. The decompression lines are lowered into the water, and finally the team descends. Today, the crew explores the wreck of a Corsair, nose down in the sand. Sections of wing without covering show the areas that had fabric instead of metal skin. The F-4U Corsair, manufactured by Voigt Aircraft, was a peppy little fighter plane. The military rejected it at first because it couldn't land on a carrier deck. But after modifications, the Corsair went on to become one of the most famous and successful airplanes of World War II. The Corsair had one of the most powerful engines available and a huge propeller, which gave the plane an odd shape with bent wings. But it was fast, 400 miles an hour. During World War II, Corsair pilots shot down over 2,000 Japanese aircraft. Its kill ratio, 11-to-1. We don't know how many enemy planes this Corsair is responsible for shooting down. We don't even know who flew it. Perhaps it was flown by the legendary hard-drinking Pappy Boyington. He assembled and led the Black Sheep Squadron that shot down 94 enemy fighters in just 12 weeks, making headlines back home. It might even have been flown by Charles Lindbergh.
Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, worked as a consultant to the military. And he traveled to Kwajalein and Roi-Namur and flew several missions in Corsairs. And the big question is, was the one that we found his Corsair? We don't know. They're, again, one of the most successful fighter craft that the Navy ever employed.
The Corsair saw combat through the Korean War. The last one was built in 1952, and the plane stayed in service a little longer than that. Few were preserved. Of the almost 13,000 Corsairs built, only a handful are still flying, like this one seen at an air show. Most of them lie silent and forgotten in places like this, the Kwajalein Atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Not far from the Corsair, we found a Dauntless dive bomber. There are dozens of these scattered throughout the airplane graveyard. The Dauntless was the standard dive bomber on aircraft carriers through most of the war. It played a key role in U.S. victories at Guadalcanal and Midway, and was one of the planes used in the initial air attacks on Kwajalein Atoll. This plane has an extra propeller stuck in its cockpit.
We found dozens of the Dauntless dive bombers. It was a favorite for the U.S. Marine Corps during the war. And we know that there was a Marine Corps contingent, air contingent on Roi-Namur, so these may have been planes associated with them.
The Dauntless, sometimes dubbed the SBD Dauntless for slow but deadly, was considered obsolete when World War II began. The Navy had planned to retire the plane before Pearl Harbor, but with aircraft in short supply, it continued to be used throughout the war. The plane went through a number of updates and improvements and ended up being among the most effective U.S. weapons in World War II. Lying silently in the airplane graveyard, the cockpit of this Dauntless has holes where the gauges once were. But even without the instruments, the cockpit makes a perfect home for a lionfish. Meanwhile, a shark lurks in the background, keeping its eye on Mark and Tom. Down here, the plane is in the shark's domain. While the shark continues to watch, Mark and Tom move on to examine an upside-down Dauntless resting on a sandy bank. Its tailhook, used to catch the plane when it landed on an aircraft carrier, is sticking straight up,
Marine life has taken over in some places. We see different types of corals growing on some of them. We see some fish intruding, some lionfish and things that have made them their homes now. That's to be expected. But for the most part, the aluminum skins on these aircraft is as clean and shiny as the day they were launched.
Mark examines an anemone fish. It's called an anemone fish because it can live within an anemone, which is venomous and will sting most fish. But the anemone fish is immune to the sting and can live safely within the anemone's gentle, caressing tentacles. This anemone grows on the fuselage of a Dauntless. With a change in the direction of the prevailing winds, the crew decided to head back down to Kwajalein Island in the south of the atoll to attempt to find a very special wreck. Although the Fumi Maru was originally discovered by Mark Miller several years earlier, finding it again proves to be a challenge. It takes several hours of searching with a depth finder around the rough coordinates before the team finally finds a bump on the bottom that looks like the ship.
Okay, guys, we should be getting really close.
Okay, there it is. There it is, guys. Hey.
All right.
There, it's coming
All right,
out.
we found it, man.
Super. This is great.
Mark it.
Got it marked. All right. Got coordinates and everything. Excellent.
Locating this wreck on the film project had special meaning to me. I originally discovered the wreck with a friend of mine named Randy Price years ago, and we found it by using a depth sounder, much like the one that we had on the vessel we were using for the film expedition. And to see it come up on the sonar again brought back a lot of memories and a lot of excitement. It's something that gets in your blood when you find a wreck on your own, and after 3 or 4 years of research, you're doing the background and saying it should be here somewhere, and bingo, you find it. It's like nothing else. It's the best.
You're all tucked in.
Before the war, the Fumi Maru was a Japanese whaling ship. When pressed into service for the military, it received a bow gun, now covered in seaweed. The ship is so small that Mark has trouble squeezing through its tight passages. Meanwhile, Tom swims under the lifeboat davits, still turned inwards. The ship went down so fast, there wasn't time to launch the lifeboats. Like many of the ships here, it's slowly being reclaimed by the sea. A beautiful bloom of bubble coral grows contentedly on the Fumi Maru, cradling a small shrimp.
The film crew asked me what we would see in this wreck, and the first thing that came to my mind was lionfish. And they said, oh yeah, we've seen lionfish all the time, yeah. I said, no, like lionfish. These are big enough to eat lionfish. And we came up from the first dive on the wreck, and everybody's eyes were really big. They said, wow, those are really big lionfish. The lionfish is a member of the scorpionfish family, and it's a venomous type of fish. The beautiful long spines you see on this thing are actually hollow, and it can inject a venom. It's a very potent toxin. It's not something that might kill you right away, but it's incredibly painful.
As Mark and Tom get ready to take leave of the Fumi Maru, they notice a gray reef shark lurking in the distance, watching them, perhaps even warning them to get out of the coral city. Gray reef sharks are aggressive and territorial. This is one fish they don't want to mess with. At the end of a long day of diving, the team still has 6 hours of work ahead of them to prepare for tomorrow. Because they are breathing custom blended gases in their rebreathers, they must prepare all their mixtures for the next day, taking into account how deep they'll be diving. Mark tops the tanks off with compressed air, while Cliff fills them with pure oxygen to the precise pressure needed. Meanwhile, production manager Christine Bird and cinematographer Greg Brunshuttle clean, disinfect, and refill the rebreathers. The white powder is soda lime, a chemical that absorbs carbon dioxide from the breathing loop. Once the tanks are full and the rebreathers clean, then everything is reassembled.
38.5.
The next day, bright and early, the team starts all over again, loading the boat and heading out to the dive site.
Upper.
The dive team has decided to film the Azakaze Maru because of its special relationship with the United States before the war. It was built in 1938 for trade with North America. It regularly sailed along the Pacific coast from Vancouver to Tacoma, San Francisco, and Los Angeles.
The Azakaze Maru is one of the more modern and larger of the freighters that was sunk at Kwajalein. It was sunk on December 5th, 1943, prior to the actual invasion by a preliminary airstrike. It was heavily damaged and burned very, very heavily, very extensive fire damage to the vessel, which has weakened some of the structures, and we see it collapsing now today, partially because of that fire damage.
The Azakaze Maru not only hauled cargo, but also had passenger accommodations. Mark finds passenger amenities still intact, like this bathtub in the communal bathing area. This was a tiled, deep soaking tub characteristic of Japanese culture.
The number 3 hold on this vessel is the coal hold, and you want to be careful in there because it's very, very dirty. You can really get gummed up fast. The huge pile of coal that was waiting to fire the engines is still there. It's bituminous coal. It's been compressed into briquettes like. They look almost like large charcoal briquettes or large beans of some sort. Swimming through the remains of the passenger staterooms, I found a shoe, and it was curious to think, whether or not that had actually been on someone's foot when the vessel went down. We don't really know. Maybe it was in somebody's foot locker, but the vessel again burned so bad, and that might be the only thing that survived. And after 60 years of seawater, a lot of times that's all you see is just remnants of clothing or shoes.
The cargo holds are pretty much empty. The Azakaze Maru was probably unloaded and heading back to Japan when she was sunk.
Okay, cast me off. Thank you. This is what it looks like. You're laying on her side.
Oh, look at that.
And I think
Some of the Kwajalein wrecks are quite dangerous for divers. The dive team approaches the Tama Maru with extra care. The ship landed on her side, which makes penetration of the wreck very disorienting and quite hazardous. What were once cabin walls now appear as floors. What was once a ceiling now appears to the divers as walls. This stool, which looks like it's hanging on a wall, is actually mounted to the ship's floor. Mark swims down through a door that looks more like a floor hatch. The divers must be constantly aware of the ship's warped perspective or risk becoming disoriented and lost. The Tateyama Maru was a medium-sized freighter, and like most of the others at Kwajalein Atoll, conscripted into the Japanese Imperial Navy for the war. The ship was sunk by aerial attacks, like most of the others at Kwajalein. Inside the cargo holds are huge steel water tanks. The islands didn't have a source of fresh water, so it had to be shipped in. At one point, Mark spots something in the silt below. He decides to go down and investigate. After some difficulty, he dislodges an old sake bottle. a very common artifact on many of these wrecks. This ship also has some other surprises.
There are human remains in the engine room. There are 2 femurs, leg bones, from a sailor who was obviously trapped or killed in the sinking. And they've been there for quite some time. Obviously, they've been since the end of the war, but I was surprised to see them after 7 years. I came back the first time I dove this ship in quite some time, 7 years, and they were still there. And normally we don't see that kind of longevity. They're usually marine creatures or something else. The bones will decay away. But they were still just as I'd seen them years ago. And we left them just exactly as we found them. As so we didn't really want to mess with them too much. That's not good, I suppose.
In the number 3 cargo hold, Tom and Mark find munitions, mostly anti-aircraft artillery shells. They were partially spilled onto the lagoon floor when the ship rolled over on its side.
There's a big heap of these cannon shells lying there in the sand and then going up into the ship. In some cases, inside the ship, you can see the wooden crates that they were still packed in, the remains of them still around the shells. They were banded together in groups of 4. And they're still live and very, very dangerous to handle.
The divers are very careful around the munitions. They are still explosive, and all these years underwater have made them less stable and far easier to set off. The members of the team are careful not to touch or settle upon anything without checking what it is first. If even one of these shells were to explode, it would kill the entire film crew. Exploring the exterior of the ship, Tom finds the anchor chain still dangling off the bow. Then he makes his way to the massive propellers at the stern, now half buried in the sand of the ocean floor 150 feet from the surface. There's a large growth of algae on the railing along the side of the ship. Meanwhile, Mark finds a hole that appears to be the lethal injury to the Tateyama Maru. A bomb dropped from a plane drove down through the top of the ship and blasted straight through the hull, bending the metal outward. The Tateyama Maru completes the team's survey of the major Japanese wrecks at Kwajalein Island. As the divers ascend to the sunlit waters above, they leave the crumbling remains of the Tateyama and her crew to the blue abyss.
I'm gonna punch it in here.
Back at the airplane graveyard, Tom and Mark encounter 2 more prominent World War II aircraft. The twin-engine B-25 was a mid-range bomber built by North American Aircraft. It's famous for the raid on Tokyo in April of 1942. One of the few B-25s that is still flying is on display at an air show. Although not as shiny, this B-25 in the airplane graveyard looks almost like it's ready to take off. The B-25's twin tail is bare, missing the fabric that once covered its rudders. The bomb bay doors that once opened to unleash fury on its enemies are now home to a peaceful growth of pink algae. The cockpit, the brains of this war machine, is now a nursery for baby fish. Only 50 yards from the B-25 lies a C-46 Commando.
To see them there in the same condition, basically, that they have been since the war is a real exciting thing. And the C-46 transport that we found still has windshield wipers on it. It played a vital role in World War II in Asia. Those planes were the ones with the DC-3s that flew over what they called the hump, the Himalayan mountains, to bring supplies back and forth to troops fighting the Japanese in different arenas.
The C-46 started out as a 36-seat passenger plane. The military loved the huge interior and immediately ordered a militarized version, optimized for transporting cargo. It played a significant role in carrying out the military's successful island hopping strategy in the Pacific, which explains how this plane got here. In the cockpit, the controls are still accessible, the throttles ready to be pushed up for takeoff. The cargo bay is enormous. Emptied of everything of value before it was discarded, the plane looks like a vast empty warehouse. The airplane graveyard lies near a beautiful coral reef. Because Kwajalein is so remote and untouched, its reefs are among the healthiest and most vibrant in the world. It looks peaceful enough, but looks can be deceiving. The sharks are watching. Mark and Tom are drawn to the giant clams that inhabit the reef. Giant clams are no myth. They can reach 3 feet across and weigh several hundred pounds. They're common on the Kwajalein reefs, but are nearly extinct in many other parts of the Pacific due to overfishing. The giant clam is not only tasty, but can serve quite a few people. Unfortunately, it can take up to 100 years for a giant clam to become a giant. The clams feed by filtering food out of the water. They draw water in through an opening called the in-current siphon and send it back out through an out-current siphon. Although they sometimes close in response to touch, as Cliff discovered to his horror, they mostly respond to light. The clams must be open to siphon and filter food from the water. They also get some energy from photosynthetic algae that live in their skin and therefore must remain open to receive sunlight. They close when the sunlight disappears at night, or when a shadow, possibly a predator, crosses their path. Suddenly, without warning, a gray reef shark shoots by, alarming the divers. The water is filled with many gray reef sharks. These aggressive animals often travel in packs, hunting together like wolves. They are territorial. Without knowing it, the team has moved into their turf, and the sharks are telling them to leave. The team knows how to take a hint. They retreat carefully back to the boat. With all the filming completed in the airplane graveyard, they can call it a day and head back down to the southern part of the atoll to explore one last wreck. Although many of the wrecks at Kwajalein Atoll can be hard to locate without a depth finder, the Prinz Eugen is not one of them. The bow lies in over 100 feet of water, but the stern sticks up above the surface with several props still attached. The Eugen actually has nothing to do with the Battle of Kwajalein, but it's the most famous wreck on the atoll. The Prinz Eugen is a German heavy cruiser built in 1936 by the Nazis. Together with the Bismarck, the Prinz Eugen was involved in the famous battle with the British ship Hood in 1941. Although the British eventually hunted down and sank the Bismarck, the Prinz Eugen escaped and survived the war, only to be surrendered in 1945. In 1946, the United States took the Eugen, fully armed and provisioned, to Bikini Atoll for atomic bomb testing. By that time, Kwajalein Atoll was an important U.S. base and the center of operations for the Bikini Atomic Test Program. Surprisingly, the Eugen survived 2 atomic blasts. Then it was towed to Kwajalein for decontamination and study. But before she could be studied, the Eugen unexpectedly rolled over and sank near shore. The opportunity to study her was lost.
The idea was to push the sinking ship towards the island of Carlson, or Inabuj, and beach it there off the pier to form a breakwater. And that didn't work. The vessels just weren't able to contain this big ship in a wind that was predominant there, and she rolled over and sank off of Inabuj, but in a position not to be an adequate breakwater. She in fact rolled over and turned upside down.
Today, the ship lies quietly, upside down, sticking partially out of the water. The atomic blast and 60 years of battering by the Pacific have taken a toll. The ship is deteriorating at a rapid rate, making the team's documentation efforts critical. Analysis by the military has determined that radiation levels are now acceptable for exploration of the wreck. The Prinz Eugen is also a very dangerous wreck to dive. Several people have died here, exploring her convoluted, maze-like interior.
It's upside down and tilted off to its starboard side. And in doing such, it's become a very awkward, disorienting wreck to dive. In that inside things are not only upside down, but they're tilted. So it's very easy to become disoriented. It's full of very, very fine silt, which is very easily stirred up. It can blind you, it can black out your lights, and you'll have to feel your way or find your line and get back out of the wreck strictly by braille. And people have actually died inside the wreck. They've become lost, disoriented, and drowned.
The ship was fully provisioned and rearmed for the bikini test. Authorities wanted to find out what an atom bomb would do to a typical ship. They stocked the food lockers and they restocked the arms. They replaced missing cannon and artillery shells so that the magazines were full, and they replaced any missing torpedoes. The ship's 8-inch artillery guns had gravity-mounted turrets. When the ship turned upside down, the turrets fell to the bottom.
It's amazing when you finally see them, the 8-inch guns, plus the huge armored turrets, plus all the mechanisms that move this thing around and loaded it. It's a very, very impressive piece of hardware. A lot of those munitions are still in place and live. It's very important to realize that these are still live munitions. The torpedoes that we see when we venture into the torpedo locker there are live. They have like 500 pounds or thereabouts of TNT in each warhead. So it's important not to play with that stuff. You know? As far as we know, they could have a bad day and just go off. Part of the galley contains a bakery, a small bakery, and we ventured in there and saw some cooking utensils still lying about, and the ovens that they would bake breads and bread products for the crew is still intact, and you can see the maker's mark on the door.
The film crew is the first to document this galley since the ship sank 50 years ago. What is especially surprising is that although atomic weapons were used on the Eugen not once but twice, it appears to have no more deterioration than the Japanese ships of the same age that were sunk with conventional weapons.
But where it hasn't been damaged, it's still working very well. Where it has been damaged...
It's another warm, sunny day on Kwajalein Atoll. Today we're not exploring wrecks, but honoring the dead on Roi-Namur. The children and grandchildren of the Japanese soldiers and sailors have returned with the permission of the U.S. government, looking for some connection with their deceased relatives. The only remains are these deteriorating ruins. This was a Japanese command post. Bullet holes from the 1944 battle are still visible. The building hasn't changed much since 1944. Yoshio Inoue was 6 years old the last time he saw his dad. The crumbling building offered a brief connection.
司令部跡が I was sent a photograph of my father. I'm pretty sure that he was standing in front of the command post that is still standing. There are scars where shells had hit the building. I put my hand on the walls. I felt something at that moment.
The Army maintains 2 memorials for the Japanese. At this memorial on Roi-Namur, everyone had a moment to step forward and pay their respects. Kazuko Fujiwara's father died on Bikini Atoll. Roi-Namur is as close as she could get to the place her father died.
It's been 57 years since I spoke to him in Manchuria. I was telling him what happened in our lives since the 4 of us left Manchuria to return to Nagano. I told him that his wife, my mother, is doing well, but is in a wheelchair now, and has been taken good care of by my brother's family. So please, don't worry about her. I told him that I was glad to see that where he is now is this beautiful island.
For Hiroshi Takemura, the opportunity to come here gave him peace of mind.
I really thought it was going to be way out in the jungle or something. I was so surprised at the beautiful way they have kept up the place. I'm so relieved I can go home with peace of mind.
Richard Sorensen has visited Kwajalein several times since that fateful day in February of 1944.
Well, the first time I walked the beach where I came in. Excuse me. I got kind of choked up because I lost some friends there. Sorry. But in going over the island, of course, I recognized where I'd been in the blockhouses, pillboxes, and so forth. And so it brought back memories.
The sun sets in the Pacific Ocean over Kwajalein Atoll. Hidden below the calm surface are the silent wrecks. They do not speak, but they do tell the story of a distant battle. The Battle of Kwajalein Atoll, a little-known footnote in the history books, remembered only by a few remaining veterans and relatives of the people who fought here. Few traces of the battle remain. The deteriorating shipwrecks and aircraft on the lagoon floor are its last testaments. Their secret location has long silenced their story, but no longer.